Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the launch of the Children and Families Initiative and Maternal Imprisonment in Ireland, a scoping study. So we have a double celebration in a sense. Celebration? I'm not sure that's the right word, but a double event today, and I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm Dr. Fiona Donson, and I'm co-chair of the Families and Children Network. Sorry, I can't even think of the name of the network anymore. So I am responsible for chairing today's event, which is very tight on time. So much of my time has gone, which is great. You don't have to listen to me. I get to introduce very important people. But first, I just want to get a couple of housekeeping issues. There is a photographer here. If you are happy to be photographed, then please smile away and cooperate. But if you have any issues and you don't want to be photographed, we completely understand. So please just flag that. The event is also being recorded, but it's just the speakers who are part of that. So just to let you know that. The report itself is not being printed out. There are hard copies of the findings, so please feel free to take those away. But the IPRT is very valuably committing to reducing the printing of reports, and of course the report will be available online. So I think that's it. Oh, the other thing is, if you are tweeting, we do have a hashtag which is maternal imprisonment. It's quite long, but it's snappy, at least in terms of it's clear in relation to what we're doing. So please do tweet away. The world needs to know more, and Ireland needs to know more about what we are doing here today. So, as I say, I'm here to chair, and my first great responsibility is to introduce Ashling Tobin, who is the co-chair of the Action for Children and Families of Prisoners Network. She joined IPRT very recently as the Children and Families Initiative Project Coordinator, so that was late last year. And this is a really brilliant initiative by the IPRT to foreground questions and policies and development of children and families in relation to imprisonment. Prior to this, she worked for 16 years in youth and community work, working with young people and their families who are actively involved or at risk of becoming involved in antisocial and or criminal behaviour. She holds a degree in human rights and criminal justice from the University of Limerick and in social care for TUD. So, Ashling, please come.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and I want to start off by wishing to welcome you all here to the launch of the Children and Family of Children and Family of People Imprisoned Initiative and the publication of the Irish Penal Reform's new report, Maternal Imprisonment in Ireland, a Scoping Study. Thank you all to the speakers who made themselves available today, and for all you who attended from your busy schedules to be here today. I do apologise in advance. I probably will stutter a lot because me and public speaking is not the most favourite thing I do. Okay, so my name is Ashling, and I am the Children and Family Initiative Project Coordinator. As Fiona said, I come with 21 years' experience of working directly with children and family, many of which were impacted by maternal imprisonment, or family imprisonment also. So I've worked by supporting these families through the complex issues that was created because of this. And you're looking at, family breakups, to housing issues, to issues with education and employment, and also increasing addictions and mental health issues. But these are only some of the issues that I would have encountered. As you can see, I would have first-hand experience of the knowledge of the impacts of maternal and family imprisonment can have on a family as a whole. It's quite clear that it's very, very complex, and I suppose it covers all various services, governmental services. Like you're looking at education, housing, justice, to name but a few. These services historically have neglected to see these cohort group as high risk and to put the adequate supports in place for these particular young people. Okay, so I suppose in IPRT, the Children and Family Initiative seek to address these failures by the services, by the government, and trying to work together to reduce harm that the criminal justice system does to the families, the children, and people in prison. So, sorry, bear with me. I have all written down. I don't want to miss something very important. Okay. We specifically hope to build on the work already done by the IPRT in this area. As many of you know, in 2012, the IPRT were one of the first to cast a light on this group with the groundbreaking report, Picking Up the Pieces. Since then, we have worked with others to maintain focus on this cohort group of children and family, and more recently is the establishment of the Network and Action for Children and Family of Prisoners alongside our colleagues from UCC. The network brings together expert knowledge from researchers, organisations and those with lived experience to identify the needs of the children and families of people in prison and proactively develop ideas for appropriate interventions and support. It has proven to be a progressive tool in advocating advocating for appropriate interventions and services. To date, it has proven a progressive tool in advocating for change, and in my role, I hope to expand on this, and particularly in the membership. We also hope to develop a robust method of integrating the voice of experience in policy formation. The voice of those with lived experience of family imprisonment and their involvement in co-designing of policies in this area is vitally important if we intend to develop an effective service that meets the needs of people in prison, their families and their children. The initiative will also seek to advocate for implementation of various recommendations made by the IPRT's 2021 report, piecing it together. Many of these recommendations are a repeat of those outlined in the 2012 report and are directed to stakeholders across the government agencies. Taken together, these various recommendations are the blueprint for this initiative and the IPR's influence in this area. Children and families affected by imprisonment have been too long waiting. It's time to take action now. So before I move on to introduce to the authors of the IPRT's Maternal Imprisonment report, I would like to introduce you to a 15-year-old boy living in rural Ireland. This child's family has been involved in the criminal justice system for many years, and within the last year, both his mother and father have been placed in prison. In this short audio clip, he explains what it has been like for him. Thanks very much.
My whole life I've had some of my family in prison. My brothers, my ma, and before Christmas, my dad. In November I had both my ma and dad in prison. I was lucky. My brother looked after me, but I wasn't too good for him. So what is it like having my ma and dad in prison? It's sad, very sad. I missed them so much. I hated them not being in my house. So when they were gone, I spent a lot of time staying with friends home. My house wasn't the same anymore. What I hated most was not seeing them all the time. I lived a long way from the prison, so I can't get there for a visit. So I only talked to my dad on the phone. My ma was released before Christmas, but I don't think she's happy without my dad. My dad cooked the dinner and gets to school, but he's not here anymore. My ma can't drive, so it's very hard. School hasn't been going good. I've been suspended a lot. I think I'm going to leave and try to get to Eatridge. I don't fit in. I'm different from all them farmers in school. Because my family are known as troublemakers, I'm stopped by the guards every time I go into town. Everyone stares at me and I hate it. Some days I just don't leave the house. I wish things were different, but nobody hears me. I miss my dad so much.
Thank you. And I was just, in listening to that, thinking about kind of key issues and the loss of so much that children experience in these situations. And I end up crying at these events, but I always find I've been working in this area for more than 10 years, and I always find it emotional and difficult. And I think the most important thing is hearing and listening. It's not just hearing, it's listening to voices, listening to the people who are in these situations. So thank you. So now I want to move on to introduce the authors of the Maternal Imprisonment in Ireland, a scoping study report. And Vicki, Prais and Sharon, Critoph, I knew I would get it wrong, I apologise, have authored this report for the IPRT. Vicki is a human rights lawyer, an independent human rights consultant. She's worked with international organisations, academic institutions, non-governmental organisations and governments to research and document human rights violations, design and deliver human rights training, and to lobby and advocate on human rights issues. She has been actively engaged in human rights for 25 years. And Sharon is a human rights professional with particular expertise in criminal justice reform, detention monitoring and torture prevention. She has a master's degree in refugee studies and 26 years of experience in working for national and international human rights organisations with a focus on research, advocacy and policy development, including substantial on-the-ground detention monitoring experience. So I'd like to welcome them to discuss their report, which is very timely and very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to IPRT for the invitation. And I'm sure I speak for both Vicki and myself to say that we're very pleased to be here today to introduce the report. So just by way of introduction, for this research, we conducted a literature review of domestic and international research to better understand maternal imprisonment, including court decision-making in Ireland, to identify gaps in available data, and to consider possible ways forward. But firstly, just a kind of reflection from myself. When conducting the research, I did actually find it quite surprising that Ireland doesn't already do more to take into consideration the best interests of the child when sentencing a mother to prison. But I also think that Ireland is well placed to make positive changes in this regard and could serve as a good example to other countries. So our recommendations in the report are made in the spirit of assisting with this. And it is important to point out that both the Irish Prison Service and the Probation Service have identified the risks associated with maternal imprisonment, and they have made efforts in developing some support programs. I'm quoting from a joint departmental strategy. They say and recognise that the outcomes for children whose mothers have experienced prison are of major concern. Children of women prisoners frequently exhibit a number of behavioural and psychological problems, and there is an increased likelihood of them becoming offenders themselves. But yet, despite this recognition from the authorities, our research found that the caretaking responsibilities of women and the best interests of their children are not sufficiently prioritised when making decisions on detention. And not only that, very little is actually known even about the numbers of children impacted and the impact upon them. Therefore, one of the key recommendations in the report is that authorities must do more to understand the issues, and this does require some dedicated research resources. And what we do know is that the number of children impacted continues to increase because, as with most countries in the world, the numbers of women in prison in Ireland has risen over the past 2 decades. Fundamentally, there should be less mothers in prison in Ireland, and this shouldn't be difficult to achieve. The United Nations Bangkok rules call for alternatives to imprisonment for pregnant women and those with dependent children to be used where possible and appropriate. And they state that women offenders should not be separated from their families and communities without due consideration being given to their backgrounds and family ties. Under international law, all children are rights holders. They have the right to have their best interests taken into account in all matters concerning them. And these rights don't disappear when a parent comes into conflict with the law. Indeed, all state parties to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child are obliged to consider the impact on children in all decisions about parental imprisonment. And fundamentally, for courts to consider the best interests of the child, they must properly assess the child's circumstances and the potential impact of imprisonment on them. And this principle should apply for pre-trial detention decisions as well as sentencing decisions. So as it's clearly established that pre-trial detention should only be used as a means of last resort in very limited circumstances and when absolutely necessary. But unfortunately, our research found that this is not the case in Ireland, as many women accused of minor offences continue to be held in pre-trial detention. So another of our key recommendations is that alternatives to pre-trial detention should be the de facto position for pregnant women and those with dependent children. But the onus should therefore be on the judicial authorities to justify why the pre-trial detention is necessary and to support that decision with factual information. At sentencing, imprisonment is still overused as a punishment in Ireland, and there's clearly scope for increasing the use of non-custodial measures for mothers. And one of the main issues is that here, as in many countries, there is no mandatory requirement to consider the personal circumstances of defendants in sentencing decisions. So while the pre-sentence and the community service reports can include consideration of a family situation, this is not a prerequisite, and judges tend not to consider them from a child's rights perspective or in light of the impact of mother-child separation. So another of our key recommendations is that specific child impact assessments be incorporated into the pre-sentence reports, or authorities should at the very least ensure that the reports contain sufficient information about family circumstances. It's interesting to note that in South Africa, for example, the law places a lot of importance on the best interests of the child in the sentencing of primary caregivers. Another example is in Norway, where sentencing guidelines stipulate that when a child's caregiver is being sentenced, external organisations such as the child's school be consulted to help determine the best interests of the child. Also, when appropriate, Norwegian courts also hear from children about their opinions and preferences. Under international law, children also have the right to express their views and to be heard in matters affecting them, including children of prisoners. However, in Ireland, we found that these children do not have their views heard. And it has been noted that the failure to consult children of imprisoned parents can result in their rights and needs being overlooked or actively damaged. In Scotland, another example, the government has committed to ensuring that the needs, views and rights of children be taken into account at sentencing. And they've noted there that the failure to do so means that the courts do not have that holistic view of the impact of imprisonment. With this in mind, we've also recommended that authorities in Ireland coordinate efforts to ensure that children of prisoners can express their views in a safe environment. We did, in the report, welcome the commitments by the probation and prison services to develop women-specific community service options, and this is in line with the Bangkok rules, which call for non-custodial measures to be gender responsive. I'd just like to finish by making a quick point there about short sentences, because there are still many women in Ireland serving such sentences. And it's important to note this because it's often overlooked that short sentences can be just as damaging as longer sentences. And even the Department of Justice itself has recognised that in saying that the imposition of short custodial sentences is not conducive to rehabilitation and can have far-reaching consequences for parenting, for accommodation needs and for employment prospects. So I will leave it at that. I'm going to pass over to Vicki, who's going to give some more insights into the impact of detention and then ways to mitigate against those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to extend my thanks as well to the IPRT for inviting us to do this report. So as Sharon mentions, I'm going to pick up the mantle and continue the story in the report there. And I wanted to address three specific areas that we look at in the report. The impact of maternal imprisonment, so the actual impact on the children. Secondly, looking at what the Irish authorities can do to mitigate the impacts. And then thirdly, a little bit about sort of research and awareness raising, and then sort of draw it together with some conclusions. Suffice to say, as we all know, that the impact of imprisonment of a mother on children is palpable. It's absolutely sort of very, very acute. And our report looks at the wider impacts, actually, of parental imprisonment generally, but time doesn't allow me to go into that. So I'm just going to drill down and look at the impacts of mothers in prison there. And really, what we found in the report was that it was a unique experience, that there was not one size fits all. There was no blueprint, if you like, for what a child's experience was when their mother was imprisoned there. What we did find that it had impacts on a child's physical and mental health there, that maternal imprisonment had an impact on the children's physical, psychological health there. And actually, most of the research that we found looked at the impact within the prison itself there. But we found that some research documented psychosomatic disorders, such as eating problems and bedwetting amongst children who had their mothers in prison there, but also that these children were less likely to access healthcare services and difficulties in accessing counselling services. We also found poor mental health being sort of prevalent across the sort of system there, with children unfortunately trying to attempt suicide or self-harm attempts, etc. And also feelings of guilt and shame and grief on the imprisonment of a mother. So this is something that we address in the report. We also look at the behavioural and the emotional and educational impacts there, that we saw that children started to act out on the imprisonment of their mother there, that they become angry and abusive, often towards the caregivers, which might be extended family. But it had a palpable impact on everyday lives, that they were treated as quote-unquote the other, and that they started to fail at school and present with juvenile and delinquent behaviour. In some cases, we document that children lead a double life, that they start to kind of say, well, my mum's elsewhere. They didn't want to say that mum's in prison there. And then finally, we look at the socio-economic impacts, the actual sort of impacts that it has on the day-to-day lives there. As has been mentioned by Ashling, we see the breakdown of the family unit, and that children are taken into care, or that they go to live with grandparents. We see a further push into poverty, so families that are already in very difficult situations, socio-economic backgrounds there is a further push into poverty when mothers go into prison there, and a real financial strain upon them. And then also, as we've mentioned, this point around intergenerational crime, that actually the research showed that children of imprisoned mothers had a higher rate of imprisonment than those with fathers in prison. So there was an interesting point there. In Ireland, really, we didn't find a whole lot of research on this area. The Bedford Row Family Project has done some work, obviously, on this, and there was one PhD report, but we didn't find a great deal of research on it. So with that in mind, what can and should the Irish authorities do to mitigate these really, really sort of difficult impacts of maternal imprisonment? And I think at the outset I want to say, and I want to say that, to recognise and acknowledge that the authorities are sympathetic to the situation of children with imprisoned mothers there. And at the policy level, we have seen some promising practice. We have seen and supportive programmes there. We saw the Family Links programme, and also we have seen the creation of the Family and Imprisonment Group, which unfortunately now is not operational. So there are pockets of promising practice, and we've seen those initiatives there. But in practice and on the ground, imprisoned parents, then their needs are not actually being adequately met. We identify two very big sort of shortcomings and gaps, that there is no national service which specifically supports children of imprisoned parents. And secondly, no cross-sectoral strategy for children affected by family members' imprisonment. So often it falls to third sector organisations to sort of pick up that gap and to sort of fill that gap. What do we say the prison authorities can do, should do, in this regard? Firstly, thinking about adapting visiting regimes, making them more family-friendly for children with mothers in prison. We saw things like home leave, things like child-friendly visiting hours, extended family visits. We also saw the rollout of video calls and phone calls in COVID and beyond, and these are really positive measures there to improve relations between family members who are separated. But also child-friendly visiting environments. There has been critique that visiting regimes at the moment lack a child-centred approach. So we would call for and recommend that that is reviewed there. And again, there have been some positive initiatives. We saw the sitting room created at Limerick Prison in conjunction with the Bedford Row Family Project, and also the creation of a family information booklet for family members, which was created by the Irish Prison Service there. And certainly we know that the new women's prison at Limerick is going to have an enhanced visiting regime for children and for family visitors there, which works on a very sort of therapeutic and rehabilitative approach there. So these are all measures which are really to be welcomed. I just wanted to make a small point in this area around the services and facilities and the kind of what comes after when mothers leave the prison there. Currently, as we know, resettlement support is provided by the Irish Association for Social Inclusion Opportunities, which works on this through care model there. And their mandate really is limited to two particular areas: the GATE service, which looks at employment and training, and secondly, the resettlement service, which is really a primary needs resettlement service. But what we found was that ISO doesn't really work with family members and family issues. So the post-release support was quite patchy in terms of women offenders there, and didn't always take into account the needs of women who are mothers there. So our recommendations in this particular area were really twofold. Well, two ones that I'd like to draw out, but there are more that we made. Firstly, that the state should establish and fund a specific national support service to provide integrated support services to children and families with a family member in prison. And secondly, to do effectively like a scoping study or a gaps analysis to try and look at, map and to review the support services that are in place, what's missing there, so that really the government can identify where the gaps are in terms of that. Finally, I just wanted to make a short point around research and public awareness raising. International standards, principally the Bangkok rules, say that it calls on states to undertake research and to promote research about the number of children who are affected by their mother's imprisonment, and also to promote research and raise awareness. So there's a call to action under international standards to raise awareness about these issues there. But what we see, and this is not only in Ireland, we see across the board, a real gap in the available data in terms of the number of children who are impacted by maternal imprisonment. Now, of course, that gap is going to affect policy. Governments don't know how many children are in prison there. Now, in Ireland, we looked at data collection in Ireland, and we found that there was no systematic collection of data about children of imprisoned mothers. And there were actually very few government efforts to collect that data there. There was no requirement on courts to record whether women who were sent to prison have dependent children. Under the Irish prison rules, there was no specific requirement to record details of a prisoner's children there. So clearly we can see that there is a data deficit, if you like. So it makes it very difficult to create policy and robust policy in light of that. Secondly, around awareness raising, we found that really there was no government sort of initiatives there, and it fell to third sector organisations to lead the vanguard, if you like, in terms of raising awareness about these issues. So you will see in our report that we make some recommendations around more robust data collection, and using that data in a meaningful way to better understand how many children are in above and prison. So just drawing it all together in a few concluding remarks, in our view and from our research that we undertook for the study there, that as Sharon said, the caretaking responsibilities of women in the best interests of children are not currently prioritised, but there are things that can be done on either a low-cost or a no-cost basis to make change, and it wouldn't take much there. But really, we're calling for a family-friendly framework, that should be in place through the whole process. Political buy-in, obviously, and that the resources are made available. I will leave it there, and I will leave you to digest the report in your own time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicki and Sharon. And if you haven't yet had a chance to read the report, I definitely recommend that you do. It's excellent. It provides a very thorough overview of not only kind of issues that we have in our own jurisdiction, but the kind of international context in relation to law, human rights framework, but also the data that is there in relation to the way in which maternal imprisonment can affect children. There is growing data globally, but as Vicki and Sharon have identified, we haven't seen that developing here, and we do have a problem with data. And it struck me in the report, so I'm just taking a moment as the chair, but what struck me in the report was over and over again was like, we don't know. We don't have data, we don't know. And we have been here so many times with the same response of we just don't know. And that is no longer acceptable, I think, in terms of moving forward in relation to this group. So I would definitely encourage you to read it and to think forward. And for the state to the state needs to embrace a policy that is cross-sectoral and actually really takes responsibility for a group that is horribly marginalised. I think the other thing that was really interesting in the way that Sharon, opened is like, it's surprising that Ireland is perhaps slow on this because we have an external reputation for being particularly good at children's rights. And we do some of that stuff very, very well. We just don't always kind of implement it quite as effectively as we could, particularly in these perhaps more marginalised areas. And that's very neatly segues me into introducing our next speaker, who is the Ombudsman for Children, Dr. Niall Muldoon. And I think one of the ways in which we are well respected is because we do have some very good institutions that are at the forefront of pushing forward and thinking about children's rights in our jurisdiction. We should be proud of that, but we need to kind of action that. So Niall's background is as a clinical psychologist, and he's worked in the area of child protection for almost 20 years, becoming Ombudsman for Children in 2015. He's worked in the Ombudsman for Children's Office as Director of Investigations, and before that he was a National Clinical Director of the Carey Foundation, a charity that provides therapy and support for children affected by sexual abuse. So I would invite him as the first kind of respondent in relation to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Just before I start, I suppose maybe just to take us back to a few words that Sharon said there. I mean, again, let's not forget why we're here. Guilt, shame, grief. This is what's happening to our children through no fault of their own. And if it's not incumbent on us as a society to help with that, then who is it incumbent on? They've done nothing wrong. They've been born into a family. They try to live their lives. They're trying to they're entitled to the best rights they can get, but yet we don't provide them with that through a whole lot of other reasons. So again, delighted to be here at this report, delighted to be involved in and to see it happening. It's such again, we oftentimes talk about big populations of children and where the issues are. This is a small population, but it's so important. At the start of this year, only in January there, myself and many others in this room went to Geneva for the dialogue stage around the review of the Irish state under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this was indeed a very rare and important moment for us to reflect on the ways in which we uphold the rights of children in all parts of our society. And I've been lucky, this is the second time I've got to go to it. But over a 2-day period in January in Geneva, a committee of UN experts asked representatives of our state to answer a wide range of questions, including about children with family in prison. And I know that a lot of the questions that came from the committee were informed by evidence provided by the IPRT through their research in general and also particularly around this report as well. The state was encouraged to think about supports for pregnant women in prison and whether enough is being done to facilitate family contact when a parent is in prison. From a children's rights perspective, there was a big question for us as a society about when we can use alternatives to prison in the case of pregnant women or single parents of young children. All of this questioning led to an acknowledgement by the government officials that facilities are not adequate for family visits. That facilities are not adequate for pregnant women, and so our prison system in Ireland is not fully upholding the rights of children. And many people here today will be well familiar with the Bangkok rules, and you've heard them mentioned already, and the Mandela rules. And these are another set of rights and standards that we'd like to highlight today. These rules are international agreements which are important benchmarks for how we treat people within prisons. The rules state that it's important to allow women caring for children to make arrangements for them prior to or on admission into prison. My office in the past has raised concerns about informal kinship care arrangements for children, which I know many children parents in prison experience. And we've received complaints highlighting the lack of clarity experienced by those children and their relative carers in kinship care arrangements as to whether they have a formal or an informal relative care placement. So again, lots of things are happening for those children, lots of change happening. Their parent has gone away, they're put into a care situation, they're not sure who's looking after them, what the rights of those people looking after them are. So some of these families then have challenges in accessing supports from the state that those informal care arrangements can get without any problems. And I'm worried that both the adults and the children in these families are being denied the support they need and are entitled to in those circumstances. So again, another added pressure through no fault of the child. Secondly, the Bangkok rules state that non-custodial sentences for pregnant women and women with dependent children should be preferred where possible and appropriate, and that this should take into account the best interests of the child. We as a state should also be ensuring the preservation of right, respect and dignity when searching children visiting prisons. Neither should family contact be stopped or reduced when disciplining a person in prison. And again, this research highlights that that can be a problem, and we would have heard that ourselves in various places. We should be conducting visits in a positive arrangements, allowing open contact between parents and children. Again, through the recent reports published by the IPRT and our own work with children, we know that many visits are still taking place with physical barriers in place, and that in some institutions there's become an over-reliance on the virtual visits of Zoom. And indeed, I think, that talking about family-friendly settings that Sharon talked about and the sitting room concept that's been introduced in Limerick, I think is excellent. But we have a great example within Oberstown of families being able to visit their children. So indeed, the child who's been criminalised has a visiting regime that we could almost think about repeating in the adult version for the child who hasn't been criminalised. So let's take a look at that and see if we can build on that. I think there's great examples within this system that we just need to spread out perhaps. So I know I have a short space of time here, so I'm only going to highlight a couple of areas that I think are very important from the report. The concept of increasing national recognition of the rights of children with a family member in prison. I think we can do that through the full incorporation in law of the UNCRC, as well as the interesting concept of creating a Bill of Rights for children as well. I think that's a really strong idea. Two very important statements which would show a state's commitment to children, one on the national level, and two, second, more specifically around these children, these cohort of children. The idea of establishing a national support service for children and families with a family member in prison, again, its time has come that this is fully resourced and well looked after. So again, as ever in this Irish state, we have othered our children of people who've done bad. Child, whether you're a parent with alcoholism, psychiatric issues, become pregnant outside marriage, we other your offspring, and we've been doing it for 100 years, and we're still doing it. And now we're always too willing to allow the voluntary sector to pick up that slack. So there's a lot of work to be done there. We're happy to leave it to vital services within the voluntary sector and the small number of very good people who are involved in places like Bedford Row and New Directions. We need to pick up and resource those people. If they're willing to do it, that's fantastic, but let's resource them properly and take it within the state system to support them. We need to enshrine in law and practice the principle of prison as last resort for primary caregivers and take that into consideration. And again, Sharon talked about the concept of making that a consideration within the judgment of a judge or the final judgments. And then improving data recording. You heard that again at the end. We heard it there from Fiona as well. There was a great moment within the UN committee meeting the state. And again, for people who haven't been there, There's 4 main committee members who look on Investigate Ireland out of the 20 committee members, and there's probably 44 state civil servants and the minister there. But one of the key investigators from the committee asked a great question about data, and continuously asked about data over the 2 days, and ultimately said, when you don't have the data, you're working blind when you create your policies and your legislation. And in every area we worked on, whether it's child protection, whether it's housing, whether it's justice, there isn't data, because with data, you have to follow through. It's time to stand up and get the data, make it happen. This is, again, a very small cohort. What are we talking about? Less than 200 women in prison at any one time. How many children do they have? It's not a hard question to ask, and it's not a difficult question to ask, and GDPR has not been the problem, because GDPR is only here 5 years, and we didn't have the figures before it. So again, data is hugely important, and ongoing commitment to that data is what can make our policies and legislations better. I'm going to conclude now with a quote from the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child at Harvard University. I don't know much about it, but it's a great quote. 2015, they said, "Children are our most precious national resource. They are the living messages to a time we will not see." So what message are the children, the thousands of children affected in this way, what message will they bring forward into 2030 and 2040 about how we treated our vulnerable children in the 2020s? Let's remember that as we build our policies and our legislation. They are the living messages into a time we will not see. So will we be apologising? Will we be looking back? Will we be doing inquiries? Let's not make it that way. Let's make sure that they are the children carrying a message forward that said we did everything possible for them. Thank you again for the invitation to participate, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niall. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm moving on, and I think one of the kind of key things is there's a number of things. One is, every child experiences this differently, so not pathologising is a very important message that Vicki and Sharon made clear at the start. But what we also know is we don't hear from those children. We don't hear from the children and their experience, and we often don't hear from the children when they become adults. So we have an opportunity here. We had the recording earlier, which was very powerful, and I'm really pleased to be welcoming Ryan O'Rourke, who was a journalist previously with the Irish Examiner, who has lived experience of parental imprisonment, to speak to us now. Thank you.
This is my first ever time doing public speaking, so please have a little bit of sympathy. Hidden victims, that's how Myrna Ryder once described us, and I couldn't think of a better way to describe us. Hidden, silent and invisible. When I was young and small and angry, I wanted nothing more to stand in a room like this and tell a crowd of people much like yourselves exactly how I felt. I mean it, I would daydream about it, getting up to stand up and be heard by people who cared and by the people who can change things. For years I wanted nothing more for my voice to be heard, which is why I found it so surprising that when I sat down to write this, I completely drew a blank. But luckily for me, not having anything to say has never stopped a journalist, which is what I used to do, from writing. So for a while I tried to force it. I read dozens of papers, articles and quotes by various thought leaders in the hope that it would inspire me, but nothing worked. So I decided to try pry into why I couldn't write about this. At first I figured maybe I'd lost that anger that once driven me. It's been a decade and maybe I was over it. Then I realised I hadn't lost it. I just put that anger and all the other emotions associated with it far away in the depths of my mind. And any attempt to open these old wounds, it was just stonewalled. So, for those of you who don't know, my father spent 4 years in prison when I was in my early teens for selling cannabis. This meant that every week, me, my mother, and my little brother would take a trip down to Limerick prison to visit my dad. These trips were a nightmare. Intimate searches, levels of scrutiny that would make the hardest of men sweat, and a general stigmatization that would impact me for the rest of my life. This is because this became the bane of my existence, and the part of the life I dreaded the most. I hated it. But my dad once told me, and this is a view shared by other inmates in the prison with him, that when a parent goes to prison, it's his family that really serve the sentence, not them. And at least I got to go home, right, and escape. However, there's more to the story than just what happens on the visiting days. My dad's imprisonment completely turned my young life around. Friends who were once there for me were now banned from ever seeing me or speaking to me. Parents would warn their children about me, despite never having known me. Even teachers couldn't help themselves by passing snide remarks and comments. I went from a kid who had friends, did well in school, and a bright future to a social pariah overnight. I was treated like a criminal so much and by so many, that I started going down that path myself. The only kids who would hang out with me, were kids that were already like me, often kids from the same backgrounds as myself. And in a darker turn, full-grown men, real criminals, started paying attention to me, seeing my vulnerability as a way to be exploited. You see, an isolated child is a vulnerable one, and an angry, vulnerable child can quickly become a dangerous one. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy, I walked further and further down that wrong path. In my mind, my life had two destinations for me, prison or death. And if not for the amazing strength of my mother and the many amazing friends I made along the way, I would likely be sat in a cell today, like so many of my friends, rather than speaking to you. But I want to make one thing clear. The reason I'm here and some of the others who I grew up with are not, isn't due to the hard work, perseverance, or anything like that. It was luck. I was lucky I had support. I was lucky that when I was pushing the boundaries between right and wrong, that I never got caught. Because a criminal record at that age is a life sentence, and it commits you to a life of crime. So don't give me any credit, really. Don't. There are thousands more children out there like me who won't be as lucky. They won't have the same supports, the same backup that I had. In fact, there are more children affected by parental imprisonment in Ireland than there are people in prison. According to Children of Prisoners Europe, the total prison population of the Republic stands at 3,724. Now that statistic might be a little bit out of date, but the number of children separated from their imprisoned fathers stands at 4,648, while a further 192 were separated from an imprisoned mother. These kids have the odds stacked against them before they are old enough to buy a pint. Back then, it was me against the world. I felt as if I had no one in my corner. There really is very little sympathy for the children and prisoners out there. The pain they will feel will never be acknowledged, nor will it be given a platform to be heard. If you lose a parent or a parent leaves you, there are supports in place to help children cope. But for those whose parents are taken away from us, from the justice system, in my experience, there's very little help. What they will find is judgment for something they've never did. It will come in different form. The other kids will be ruthless, but that's just the way kids are, so you can hardly blame them. But so too will the adults, and that will hurt the most. I do want to make one thing clear. I don't expect that to change. People are always going to judge, particularly in Ireland. This seems to be a thing we're very good at. But what I would like to see is the support structure put in place. Make sure no child stands out there alone. Make sure they know that they have someone in the corner. Let them know that they're not evil or wrong or criminals just because of the circumstances of their birth. Help them shed that burden of guilt that they feel that they have inherited. You won't just be helping them, you'll be helping society at large. Children of incarcerated parents are 5 times more likely to end up in prison themselves. But I'm willing to bet my life that if we were to put structures in place, to put someone in these kids' corners, someone that they could feel that's on their side, and let them know that they aren't alone, that would change dramatically. In Ireland, as of 2019, it costs $68,000 a year to keep a prisoner in jail. If I'd grown up to be like my dad, which was a very real possibility, and I had served a 4-year sentence, it would have cost you, the taxpayer, $270,000 at the least. Instead, I'm standing here, I'm paying taxes, I'm working, and I'm contributing. Let's help more children grow up and do the same. I said it before, and I'll say it now again. Treat a man like a dog, and you'll soon get bitten. Treat a child like a criminal, and your prisons will always be full. Now it's time to break the wheel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and I have nothing to add in follow-up to that. It's very powerful. Thank you. So I welcome our next speaker, and that's Áine Morris, who is Senior Probation Officer and member of the Probation Service Women's Strategy Group. She is an experienced probation officer whose career spans 20 years. In that time, she's worked in Ballymun and Finglas and moved to the Docus Centre, where she worked with women during sentence and post-release. During a time in the Docus Centre, Áine completed research on the needs of women leaving custody, and she's worked on both the community service and homeless team, as well as the restorative justice and victim service unit. So she is extremely experienced in this area. So, thank you.
Morning, everybody, and I'd just like to thank the Irish Penal Reform Trust for inviting me to speak here today. And I think it goes without saying that the Probation Service welcomes today's report, and there is much for us to reflect on and learn from it and its recommendations. It very much reflects the thinking of the Probation Service's Women's Strategy Group, of which I am a member, and we in our work are keen to endorse the points that are made in the report. Indeed, we'll discuss this report at our next meeting. So the Women's Strategy Group has been in place since the publication of the Irish Prison Service and the Probation Service's joint strategy on effective practice response to women who offend. That was in 2013. And since that time, we've developed our own best practice document, which is working with women who offend. And it really promotes a gender-informed approach, very clearly lays out what that approach means and how it translates to our day-to-day practice in working with women. And I think it greatly strengthens our work. And you cannot work in a gender-informed way without considering women in their role as mothers and carers for their children. So in addition, our Learning and Development Unit has developed and rolled out a gender-informed approach to working with female offenders. It's a module that's run over 4 days, and it's delivered on a rolling basis. And that has been that's been developed in the last 2 years, and I myself participated in that. And it really looks to make probation officers aware of recent developments and working effectively with women and working with them in the community and considering their role as mothers. And looks really at the impact of maternal incarceration. And so I think you can see that we are mindful of many of the points that are raised in the report. Recently, officers and colleagues in our funded community-based organisations have received training in seeking safety, which is a well-recognised programme which looks at, it's present and it's skills focused, and it's about really looking at the trauma that women have experienced and their issues with substance misuse. Really, our work as we work with women is trying to empower them and help them to really exit the criminal justice system and, reduce the risk of further offending and reduce the risk of imprisonment. And I think one of the key points that has been reflected on this morning is the need for a pre-trial stage and a sentencing stage, for the impact of maternal incarceration to be considered. And one way in which we are doing that is in our pre-sanction reports to court. And in our personal circumstance and our background information, probation officers through all of these initiatives have, to the forefront of their mind, the impact for children of mom going into custody, and as well as that, for probation officers in their assessments to be speaking to women about their anxiety about what will happen to their children should they receive a custodial sentence, and really look at community-based alternatives to imprison. And we have at our disposal, a range of community sanctions that offer an alternative to custody. And where we work with women on supervision, where people are placed on periods of supervision in the community, we try as much as possible to highlight to women their strengths and their resilience. And in turn, our hope is that supervision will lower the risk of offending and strengthen their ability to parent, and thus protect their children from that intergenerational contact with the criminal justice service. I think that's really key and important. And one example of our gender-informed practice is our ability to allocate 50% of community services hours as integrated community service for women. So helping community service work for women. And, you know, we have 2 specific female-specific programs available through our community-based organisations. And, you know, where it's in a geographical area where maybe it's not possible, we look at individual placements. So it's really about making sure that community service can act as a positive way for women to, you know, to have an alternative to custody in the community. We also have community return, and while the numbers are low, they are in proportion to men who are availing of the programme. And I think we're looking, you know, to strengthen community return and to increase its success in the community. In terms of housing, we offer 2 transitional housing projects in Outlook and Tusnua. In our work with women who are resident there, we really look at strengthening their connection with their children. And that often can be children as well who are in care and looking to strengthen the access arrangements and to help women ensure that their access time with their children is positive. We have worked with SAIL to develop BRIO, which is peer-led, and we're looking to replicate that model with other community-based organisations we work with. And I suppose importantly, we have, you know, direct feedback from, in the Women's Strategy Group, we've had direct feedback from women who avail of BRIO and SAIL, and have had to, you know, take into account their views in terms of our practice in working with them and what would improve our practice. So I would like to commend this report for raising the issue of the number of traveller women who are incarcerated. I think that's really important. Travellers as a population are they're overrepresented in the prison system, but they're also overrepresented on our own caseloads. And I think that it's one area that needs particular attention, and indeed for other minorities, you know, it's important that we give that special attention. So just to conclude, and thanks for bearing with me, this report reflects the impact of maternal incarceration and the need for those of us working, you know, on the front line with this population to have these issues at the forefront of our mind in our work. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Áine, and also thank you for flagging the point that within the community that we're looking at, there are sub-communities, but there are groups within that we know even less about and are even more marginalised, and really, you know, we need to be understanding more and reflecting more. So the traveller community would certainly be kind of key to that, and other ethnic minority groups. It's something that, again, we need the data, and we need the research, and we need the services. There are some wonderful services already operating in that sector, but the supports are absolutely needed. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to Fergal Landy, who is the CEO of the National Forum of Family Resource Centres. Fergal has worked in children, family and community services for over 20 years. Initially, he worked in frontline practice as a social worker and community development worker before moving to academia as an applied researcher in service design and policy development. More recently, he worked with TUSLA to support the implementation of prevention, partnership and family support practice in children and family services. And he has a degree in social work and a master's in international law and human rights.
Thanks very much, Fiona. I suppose I just wanted to start by saying I think we've heard a lot today from people who know a lot about this issue, so I want to qualify my expertise. I'm one of these guys that knows a little about a lot of things as opposed to a lot about a little of things. So maybe that's why I was asked to kind of allow us to take a step back, I suppose, from the specialist area. And as Fiona has said, I worked in various different roles and have ended up in this current role as CEO of the Family Resource Centre National Forum. And I think in that capacity, I can say that we welcome the report, and family resource centres are interested in being involved in these types of particular areas of work. And I'm open to exploring opportunities for how we can support the implementation of the recommendations of the report. In terms of what we can do ourselves within the National Forum, I think we are looking at the data systems at the moment that family resource centres use, and I'll certainly be cognizant of thinking about how we can have better data, because I don't have data here today to talk about. It's not visible to me to what extent family resource centres support children and families impacted by imprisonment. So we need to start collecting that. I mean, obviously the state system is more important, but we can do our bit by starting to look at to what extent parental imprisonment is a reason for families seeking support from family resource centres. In terms of the response, we like to talk about our response as being situated within a rights-based approach to community development and family support across the life course. Right? That's a bit of a mouthful, but really there's pros and cons in that, I suppose. We're trying to take the most systemic, the most broadest approach. We don't work only with children and families, we also work with older people. We don't work with any one cohort within the community, we work with the whole community. And the way the system of government, I feel, works in Ireland at the moment, and the system of funding of the community and voluntary sector can sometimes work against that. It can sometimes be along the lines of specific cohorts of population. So, you know, as the Family Resource Centre moved into Tusla, obviously the biggest concern of many of the members were, what does that mean for our work with individuals and older people within the communities? So we're always trying to re-explain that, I suppose, that people don't live in those boxes, people don't live in those silos. Nobody, you know, and we don't. We know that as human beings. We don't go home and live in our communities as children, as families with children or families without children, or as older people, or as unemployed people. We live as communities. We exist as communities. And I think, you know, we just need to figure out from a state provision point of view how to work with that, rather than sometimes working against that. And I just caution that this issue, like any other issue, needs to be thought of in that way, as a community issue, as a societal issue. And it's with communities that solutions will be found. And that idea of a national support service, I do welcome, that's in the recommendations. But the integrated support that people need and people will experience and people have a right to will be experienced at local level. It'll be experienced in communities, rural communities, urban communities around the country. So in the voluntary sector, I think we have an opportunity to give a thought about that interrelationship between what might be a national coordination, national advocacy support, good communication, but understanding that everything is local in many ways as well. And the integration piece happens at local level within communities, and certainly not contributing to what sometimes can feel for communities like silification or a fragmentation of services along the lines of state agencies. Specifically then, I just took some of the headings within the report to think about it as it related to FRC. So I think around participation, obviously a child's right to participate in, meaningfully and to have their views taken into consideration is important. It actually echoes with the community development principle around participation and empowerment. So it's very consistent with our way of working. And I think what FRCs could offer there as part of that recommendation is a safe and familiar place for children who are impacted by imprisonment, and particularly maternal imprisonment, to express their views about it as part of partnerships with other NGOs and with state agencies. We also kind of endorse and are members of the Prevention and Early Intervention Network, so we endorse a prevention and early intervention response. So I think FRCs can play a role in raising awareness within communities, changing attitudes and reducing the stigma that we've talked about as well. And then also coming down to the more particular, to the individual families who may be at risk of imprisonment impacting the family before it happens, working with those families, and when it happens. And again, I think it's something for state services to figure out, but our understanding of progressive universalism in this country needs a little bit of teasing out, because we tend to take from literature that borrows from around the world about progressive universalism. What I mean is like targeting or topping up with individual cohorts like this. And it might be children impacted by imprisonment, but you have children impacted by parental substance misuse, by domestic and sexual violence within the home, parental mental ill health, whatever it is. These top-ups and targeted interventions are required for children with particular needs. But as it was referenced earlier, every case is different as well. So that can't be some sort of uniform response. That has to be delivered within the context of individualised but integrated support to that family. And top-up supports in other countries, I'm not saying all other countries have it all figured out, but often top-up supports happen within the context of really well-resourced frontline universal public services, through schools, through the health service, through the social protection system, and so on and so forth. So, top-up supports look different depending on what the normative supports are within society. And if the normative support societies within, and Niall has commented on this on other occasions, if they're not adequate, then the top-up support service is not building on a foundation of adequate support services. And the expectation then of those can be unrealistic. So I think this needs to be seen in the context of the health service, the education system, and the social protection system for these families, which, as Niall said, are a very small cohort of families overall. We have a particular involvement just in community-based counselling, again with a preventative lens, so therapeutic services funded by TUSLA, and often funding leverage from other various sources and pots, including this year from the HSE, around creative therapeutic responses to young children. And I think there's, obviously it's a small cohort, but some of those children may be children who have been impacted by poverty. So bringing the skill sets to those kind of community-based therapeutic services is important, I think. And lastly, and this was only one I thought of, which is the benefit of coming to these, it's just when Áine was referring, and I think you said a few times, to in the community, and as well, oh, that's me, right, so we are the community, we are in the community. And we're involved in another initiative which is in a different area around social prescribing with the HSE, where people who present for mental health difficulties or physical health difficulties can be offered social prescribing, meaning a community alternative, a non-clinical response to their presenting problem. And I think there's opportunity there for FRCs to be involved in the non-custodial responses that you referred to, Áine, in some ways, because the activities in the community that someone might engage in as a part of a non-custodial response are often happening within all sorts of places, but including family resource centres. So I think for the moment, you're looking at me, Fiona, like I'm probably, I've used up my time unexpectedly, so thanks very much.
Thank you. It's amazing how quickly the time disappears in these events. So I'm coming to our last respondent, and that's Gallagher, KC, sorry, I was about to say QC, who is an Irish-born barrister but based in London, specialising in human rights and civil liberties. And she's recently been appointed as Ireland's special Rapporteur on child protection, which is a very welcome appointment. She has a lot of experience in relation to children's rights and has acted in leading cases, including ones of the importance of hearing children in relation to extradition proceedings, in relation to parents, which has parallels with what we're thinking about here, and also the treatment of children as adults in custody. But she also has acted before the European Court of Human Rights and UN Special Protection Measures, so she comes with a huge amount of experience. So we're very grateful for her being here and welcome her.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and thanks very much for having me. Many of you may have seen your social media this morning flooded with images of World Book Day, and it seemed to me there's such a stark contrast. I this morning saw friends from around the world posting pictures of their hastily put together costumes and very well thought through costumes for their children. I personally, this day every year, always think it's time to write a book about the boy who went to school in a perfectly normal costume. But it's so stark when we had the words from that 15-year-old in the audio clip describing the trauma and profound stigma of the position that he was in, saying, I don't fit in, my family are known as troublemakers, everyone stares at me, and the incredibly powerful words we heard from Ryan. There could be no starker contrast. I think it's fitting in many ways that we're having the discussion today in those circumstances. As you've heard from Fiona, I've recently been appointed as Ireland's Special Rapporteur on Child Protection, which is a government-appointed role. I'm answerable and report to the Oireachtas, but it is entirely independent. And the first thing that I wanted to say, I'm in the first 4 weeks of my appointment. I was appointed on the 1st of February. My annual report is being drafted and will be coming out later in the year, but I'm finalising it in June because there was a hiatus period between me and my predecessor, Conor O'Mahony, when there was no one in post. So I've got a rather early annual report, which will be covering 6 months when no one was in the role, and then a few months when I was in role. And I want to give a commitment today to Vicki, Sharon, and everyone in the room that I will consider extremely carefully this report and consider whether this report and its recommendations should be echoed in the recommendations I, in turn, make to government. Because this is a vitally important report on such a key issue. And I pay tribute to the work of the IPRT over the years, casting a light on this topic which is often forgotten. Many of you may remember, it's almost a decade and a half ago now, in 2010, when Liam Herrick spoke on these precise issues on radio and in the press, April 2010, on overcrowding in the Docus Centre, increasing numbers of women imprisoned for non-violent offences and receiving short sentences. I remember 2018 hearing Deirdre Malone talking to News Talk about many of these issues. So, and you heard earlier about the 2012 seminal report. So IPRT has been banging this drum for quite some time and raising awareness of these issues for quite some time. And today we now have added to that body of work this superb report, which I've only had the opportunity to skim read, but I guarantee I will read in far more detail and consider it carefully for my annual report. I do think what Sharon said was so important about it being surprising Ireland doesn't do more, but there also being a great opportunity for Ireland to do more. Ireland does indeed, rightly, have an external reputation in respect of human rights. It's hugely well respected. When I deal in Geneva or in New York at the UN with Ireland, Ireland is so well respected, and you can see over the last number of years the role Ireland has played in the UN, in the Council of Europe, and other countries do look up to it. We also have the government in 2019, in its policy on children and youth, in its opening sentence, saying the government aims to improve outcomes for children and young people and make Ireland one of the best countries in the world in which to grow up and raise a family. So they've set themselves a high yardstick, they have an international reputation, and it's precisely why we need to ensure that recommendations like those that are made today can deal with whether there is a mismatch between that international standing and what in practice is happening on the ground. There's also a great opportunity, given the work that's been identified by Sharon and Vicki that's already underway, and the commitment we heard about so powerfully there from Áine about the work that she's doing. Now, it was mentioned by Fiona in outline that I have worked on many of these issues over the years. I've worked for clients who are pregnant women or women who are mothers in prison, and for children who are facing separation from parents as a result of imprisonment or indeed extradition. And many of those themes that I see in those cases that I do internationally are picked up in the report today. And these are issues which are not unique to Ireland. That's why there's a particularly great opportunity for Ireland to be a leading light in this issue. Ryan used that phrase, hidden victims of imprisonment, earlier, that very powerful phrase used by Cunningham and Baker in their work in 2005. And many academics over the years have used similar types of phrases. I think it's Shaw who described children of parents who are imprisoned as orphans of justice and the Cinderella of penology. So you get these kind of phrases recognising exactly what Ryan was talking about it in his powerful remarks. But despite the numbers of children experiencing parental imprisonment rising internationally, despite there being a growing recognition of the risk factors linked to parental imprisonment, including mental health problems, educational difficulties, offending, unemployment, drug use, very little remains understood about the causation between those factors. And one of the fundamental problems we have, and I want to echo what was said by Niall earlier, is the issue of data gaps. So I wanted to make 3 points. The first one is about data gaps. And this is not unique to Ireland, but it is something where Ireland also suffers from this. There is a statistical and policy blind spot in relation to this issue. You simply do not have the data. Without the data, you cannot construct policies which reflect what is needed. Now, this is something which has been raised repeatedly by international bodies, and I wanted to turn to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, their general comment, number 14, on the best interests of the child, just to flag this. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, when thinking about the concept of best interests, has emphasised for over a decade that the best interests of the child is three things, a threefold concept. It's a substantive right, as we all know. It's a fundamental interpretive legal principle. When you're faced with two different ways of approaching an issue, you choose the issue which is child-friendly. But also, thirdly, it's a rule of procedure. And this is what the committee said in 2014 in that general comment. Whenever a decision is to be made that will affect a specific child, an identified group of children, or children in general, that decision-making process must include an evaluation of the possible impact, positive or negative, of the decision on the child or children concerned. Assessing and determining the best interests of the child requires procedural guarantees. And we simply cannot assess or determine the best interests of the child, let alone meet the best interests of the child, unless we have procedural guarantees and we have that data. That's critical. Second point I wanted to make is about imprisonment in the first place. And I pay tribute to the authors for focusing on this issue in their report. Because what we have, as this report shows, is a situation where often you have women who are mothers of dependent children, often primary caregivers or lone parents, being on remand. You often have them being imprisoned and receiving custodial sentences for non-violent offending. And you often have them receiving short sentences with all the devastating impact that that can have, particularly when they're lone parents or primary caregivers, which women are more likely to be statistically. Now, the profound impact on both the mother and the child, of course, engages multiple rights. Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, series of rights for the women, series of rights under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it's essential that when a decision is being taken that has that profound and grave an impact, which may have lifelong impacts for the woman and for the child, or in fact, multiple children in many cases, that there must be a very careful proportionality analysis. And there's an obligation on the state to show that it's conducted that proportionality analysis. And it concerns me that the work in this report suggests that at sentencing stage, that basic principle is not always complied with. Again, I go back to the data. We need to understand better what's happening at sentencing stage, whether there are compelling and persuasive reasons which comply with international standards and domestic law standards for imprisonment. Is there compliance with those, that long body of case law from the European Court of Human Rights, W in the UK, K and T against Finland, about what's required to justify separation of mother and child at that point? So imprisonment in the first place, is it justified? And the recommendations there are critical. And then thirdly, when imprisonment is justified, the report and its recommendations on the mitigating impact of maternal imprisonment on children and indeed on women is of vital importance. These are particularly vulnerable cohort groups. They are cohort groups that are often forgotten, that are in corners, dark corners, forgotten, subject to stigma, as we heard from Ryan and as we heard from the young man on the audio. It's vital we cast a light on this. It's vital we fill those statistical gaps, and it's critical that the work that the IPRT and others are doing, casting a light on this issue, continues. I'll consider this carefully, and I will let you know what I say in my annual report about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know we're running very short on time, but I'd still like to invite our respondents up to the front, and I'm going to use chair's privilege, sanctioned by Molly, to reduce the number of questions that I'm going to ask to one. And the question is basically, there's an interesting discussion we can have about why children are forgotten and families are forgotten. But really, I think what we need to ask is, what's the one thing that, if you could choose one thing, all you have is one thing to do, what will that be? And that will get things started. So if you want to kind of come up and take a seat, your names are on the chairs. I suppose the question is, obviously choosing one thing, but what is the one thing that can have the biggest impact? What can make the biggest change that we could do? Because it's very clear from the discussion that we've had is that we know that we've been here many times and we've had lots of discussions, we've talked about things that we can do, but that we need to start making changes. So
Niall, you're sitting next to me. No pressure.
Yeah, okay, one magic bullet.
Or at least starting things off. It could
Yeah.
even be the
Yeah.
kind of things that get things
I
right.
think, I mean, what I've done here in my own notes is just that sort of consideration of family situation and from a children's right perspective prior to sentencing. I think sentencing may happen, it may still happen, but it's incumbent on us then to support the children that are there in the best way possible. So again, it's that concept of the journey towards the sentencing and outside the others. Is considering from a child's rights perspective, the impact on them and the support they will need if their primary caregiver has gone in. Is care the right way? Is it relative care? Is it foster care? Whatever it might be, and is that fully supported? To me, that's a starting point, because what you're doing then is putting the children on an equal level with the possible prisoner, and that's crucial. And again, I think that's way at this moment in time, we're doing a better job with the prisoner and considering the impact on them, and the pre-sentencing work that's been done there is hugely important. But we need to offer the support as well when we do the children's rights. So it's no single way of doing it, but I think that's, and the other part I think I might put in is just the work that I hope will be done through Child Poverty Unit, because I think there's a lot of work that can be done to support in the overall society. That's very short.
Thank you. No, I'm very impressive to kind of straight in there. And I think one thing that always strikes me is we talk a lot about what happens at the end stage in terms of the prison. We end up discussing very little, and we get very little judicial engagement with that kind of beginning stage. And I thought it was very interesting, kind of Keelan mentioned the point that, and it's clearly in the report, imprisonment is a problem. Putting people in prison is a problem. And so actually raising that question of, do you need to do that? Is crucial to actually making change. So.
And considering how long it takes us to get to a prison sentence,
Yeah.
We have 18 months, 2 years to work on it, so I think there's an opportunity there.
Thank you.
For me, it's making sure there is somebody there for every child who's going through this, whether it's a social worker or some other system put in place. When I was visiting my dad in prison, the only person in that system who was any bit kind to me, who showed me any bit of support, was a volunteer lady who was serving tea and coffee to the families who were waiting. She was lovely. She was the only bright spark in the whole thing. By the time I eventually ended up in counselling due to other traumatic incidents in my life, but by that time I had already turned against every adult and every person I thought was part of the system that had put me and my family in this situation. That led me down a dark path, and I have friends now who at this very moment are sitting in prison because it led them down a bad path too. You put someone in that kid's corner and you tell them, because crime doesn't happen in an echo chamber, and there's going to be other criminals around them. There's going to be all that's going to be around them, to be fair, is crime. So to be able to bring someone in and tell them that you don't have to live this life. Your future isn't set in stone. We're here to support you. None of this is your fault. That will make the world of change. And honestly, I'd say if you were to start it now in 18 years' time, in 20 years' time, you would see a huge dramatic drop in the amount of people in prison in this country.
Yeah, and I think that's really valuable, because I think what's very clear is that we always say one good person, one person can make all that difference, and it doesn't matter where that person comes from in a sense. It needs to be a person that will listen and be there. And research that we did in terms of the visiting spaces, we interviewed people about understanding children's rights in visiting spaces, and it was actually interesting. It was the support workers in the waiting rooms, people who often had a childcare background, who were there and actually were getting down and sitting with the kids and listening. And basically, we're just there to listen to them. We're there to kind of chat and do a bit of art and be there and just be a person as that kind of like a normal kind of interaction, because all of it is so abnormal and harmful, so actually, yeah. And schools, we can talk about all the different institutions where those people can come from. Sometimes schools can be a harmful place, but it can also has the potential for being a positive intervention, so there's lots of it. But thank you, yeah, and I think, and that clearly brings us into support organisations and networks around how we kind of make that.
Yeah, so I suppose one thing that I'm struck by is the number of women who are in custody on adjournments and, you know, the shorter sentences. And I think if we use pre-sanction reports and probation service reports to look at what is the impact on their personal circumstances, on their families, on the children that they care for, and, you know, because I think probably the most profound thing here today was the voice of both Ryan and the voice of the audio piece of the child that was played, and that we highlight not only the woman's voice but also her children's voice.
And I think that's, you know, kind of integrating that in and figuring it out. It's not rocket science. It will take change, but it requires a commitment to make that change, I think, and understanding the importance of those voices in the system. Thank you. Fergal.
Writing furiously here. I think if we could do one thing, it would be for the government at a central level, and as I understand that, I mean the Taoiseach, decide who has the lead role in relation to this issue. Because I think my experience over the years as a social worker and in different roles, and I don't think I'd be the first to say this, is that sometimes we have a poor track record, particularly when different state services cover an area. And it isn't crystal clear to everybody who has the lead responsibility. And we've seen that over the years with care and justice. I mean, when I first worked as a social worker, that was what we were all talking about at the time. I think I've heard anecdotes in the last few days that even within a state agency, when a child falls between different units or departments within that agency, for example, a child that may have a disability but also may have a mental health problem, also may have a psychological issue, we don't seem to be able to understand who's centrally involved in making sure that all those other departments do what they're meant to do. So to me, two slab responsibilities in this area: the Department of Social Protection, Court Service and Judiciary, and other people are more expert on that, the Irish Prison Service, the Department of Education, the Probation Service and the HSE, and I might be leaving someone out. And that's a pretty crowded space. I don't really understand why we deliver government in that way, but anyway, we do. So in that crowded space, who has lead responsibility? And my basic understanding, and I'll defer to Caoilfhionn on this, is that the Child and Family Agency Act under Section 8 sets it out really clearly that the statutory duty to promote the development and welfare of children and families is TUSLA. So I think somebody needs to step into a central role and coordinate the other agencies at agency level and not have children falling in between state agencies.
Yeah, thank you. And the policy level is always the hardest to kind of factor into and kind of get that leverage. And that we talk a lot, I think, about interagency and holistic approaches, but there is a real danger in that space of there's lots of people not necessarily doing much or not working together. So having
or lots of people doing a lot, but no clarity as to who's centrally responsible.
Difficulties in coordination. So having someone who will take the lead, and also going with that is budget and
it's all about budget at the end of the day, or it needn't be, or it shouldn't be, but that's where it breaks down when one of those entities is asked who's going to pay for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, the problem with going last is I'm kind of persuaded by everyone who's gone before me. That's such a powerful point about fragmentation and who's got ownership of the issue. Ultimately, where does the buck stop? I suppose for me, when you have women who are mothers already in prison, one of the things I often see with my clients, I don't know if others have had this experience, when you have men released from prison, and this happens, you know, in multiple jurisdictions, there's various people at the prison gate, someone's packed a bag, there's people there, and that doesn't happen with women in the same way at all. Because often the women who are in prison, and this is not unique to Ireland, happens in many jurisdictions, have the kind of features that Áine spoke about very powerfully earlier, including increased representation of the traveller community and so on. But also many of them are victims of domestic violence, gender-based violence. Many of them are lone parents. Many of them don't have good support networks. Many of them are victims of particular poverty. So you have huge problems when they come out the prison gate at the end, often at the end of quite a short sentence or even a period of time on remand. So I suppose for me, for women and children in those circumstances, I'd say the one word is continuity. And that's partly about having a key contact for the child, like Ryan has spoken about throughout, so you know who your point of contact is. You've got some continuity during the prison period and indeed when you're resettling afterwards. But also for women while in prison, think it's so important that the Irish Prison Service and the Probation Service in their pre-release and their post-release services ensure that there's continuity, there's single point of contact or a group of contacts where there's continuity in that way and that it's trauma-informed. And of course, on the pipeline issue about sentencing, I think this is so critical. All of the legal standards say imprisonment in these circumstances is intended to be a last resort, but there's a mismatch between that principle and what we're seeing in practice and what's laid bare by this brilliant work by the two authors. So I would hope that as soon as you have, at a minimum, increased visibility of the child at sentencing stage, that in itself should start to change that dynamic and should lead to an increased use of non-custodial measures. That's what we've seen in other jurisdictions when you have an increased visibility of the child at sentencing stage. And of course, in line with Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's not just visibility of the child is supposed to be heard from and to be part of that process. And in other jurisdictions, we do see when that happens, you start to shift the dial.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I could talk all day about this. I'm not going to. I think we have a few minutes left to open it out to questions. I'm very conscious of time. But does someone have? Oh, you have. You have a question.
We have legislation that provides for the provision of restorative justice. Why don't we have enough restorative justice projects, trauma-informed restorative justice projects, that women can be diverted to upon arrest? A lot of the women that I have come across who are in prison are there because of trauma, long-term trauma, and to send them to prison just adds to that trauma. So why, when we have the legislation, there's the funding there, we don't have the projects? Why? Why are women such a low priority?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, so I suppose restorative justice and, you know, the ability of restorative justice to help women recognise the harm that is caused maybe by their offending behaviour and help them repair that harm is indeed something that the Probation Service is eager to continue to grow. So we established our Restorative Justice Unit in 2017, and we're increasing our numbers and encouraging probation officers as part of assessment to consider restorative justice as a form of intervention with our entire client group. But I think you're right, it is a form of justice that can be used really effectively with this population. So we're increasing it, and we continue to recommend it in court reports. And I suppose we're at a point where we've started this process, and we're growing our own restorative justice work and training, and we have trained probation officers in restorative conferencing and victim offender mediation as well.
And I think I was just saying in the context of women and the system, the prison system and the criminal justice system is designed primarily for men, who's the largest group. They're the largest group within the system, and there's a tendency for women get dragged along, as though we'll just follow on.
And I think on that point we have to be very mindful of, not increasing a woman's sense of shame, and that causing, her further difficulty. It's really about working through those emotions to repair the harm in the community.
A few of you had spoken about different models that you've seen for consulting children of parents who are going to be incarcerated in the sentencing process. Can you speak about some of those models or practices that you think would work well here?
I'm happy to say something about that to some extent. I mean, it's challenging and it's important, and it needs to be done in a way that is not harmful. But there are models globally in relation to this. So, for example, the Prison Reform Trust in the UK is currently trialling a child impact assessment tool. It's not necessarily directed in relation to the court proceedings. It's done generally as a model of allowing children to be heard and I actually posted this on Twitter this morning. But it's actually being trialled out, and the woman who's developed this, Sarah Beresford, has done it from a kind of children's rights perspective, basically saying it can be anybody who hears that. You know, children. The first step is hearing the child. So it could be anybody within a system. It could be used within a kind of probation context and pre-trial report, and there's very structured ways in which you can do that. So that's one model. The other way is to do it through support organisations, schools. There's a flexibility there. That may not feed into strategy or specific responses at a national level or in relation to kind of court response, but it's allowing the child to be heard and the child's understanding of where they are and what they need, and that can be factored in terms of support systems. So there are a number of different models, and I'd be happy to kind of share that if you want to kind of get in touch. But I think one of the things I want to say in relation to that is there's a lot of international practice. We don't have to create things from the start. We can see, and I think the report's very good at providing some of that experience of good practice internationally that we can adopt. We don't need to start from kind of creating new models, seeing what works elsewhere.
Can I just say on that, I mean, I think from our point of view, Ireland has struggled manfully failed so far in getting the voice of the child in anywhere in the judicial system. You know, we have it within we changed the constitution, and we only put into a small element children's right or children's voice should be heard within certain areas of family law and everywhere else. We haven't done that properly yet. So I would love to see this happening. And again, I think it's looking at widening who can hear the voice of the child. I think the judges are nervous. It's not their style. They've never been there before. Future judges, it won't be as scary for them. But I think in this area, I think there's lots of professionals who would be very well capable of helping to hear the voice of the children in this situation, whether it's a teacher, a public health nurse, a probation officer, whoever. I think so. I'd be very hopeful in this situation that we could get the voice very, very clearly.
And I would add that the Prison Reform Trust toolkit is available. Anyone can use it. It's out there and can be developed into practice. So they're very keen for people to trial it in terms of understanding kind of how it can work.
Could I just add something quickly on that? So I'd second what you say about the Prison Reform Trust. I mean, it's 10 years ago now since we did a case in the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom called HH, which is about, I acted for the children in the case through the official solicitor who was representing them. But their parents, they were an Italian family living in the UK, and both their parents were facing extradition to Italy. And there had been zero assessment of the impact of that. So the result was going to be the children were going to be placed into care. Two of the children were very young, and it was at a time when we then got psychological evidence, and we were able to show that the impact of separation from both parents would be profound. It hadn't occurred to anyone to think about, well, are there alternative ways of managing this? Would Italy accept, for example, extradition of one parent, not the other? No one had even looked at what are the arrangements in Italy. Can the children go to Italy? What are the arrangements? Can the younger children be in prison? Literally no one had gathered any information whatsoever, and they were proceeding on that basis. So we brought a case for the children, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, was in front of 7 Supreme Court justices, and lead judgment on what should happen in these circumstances was given by Lady Hale. We were joined to a Scottish case as well, similar thing, both parents due to be extradited at the same time. And we essentially had to design a system from scratch. So what we did was, we said, well, look, you have a system where social services in Scotland and in England and Wales already have to produce assessments, multi-agency assessments of children in need in a range of circumstances where they go and they speak to the school and they speak to the GP and so on. And why can't we just adapt that mechanism? So that's what then happened in those extradition cases. So we adapted an existing mechanism. So I'd really agree with Fiona on that. And I think what the report says about the idea of child impact assessments is a really powerful one. And the idea of child impact assessments being incorporated into pre-sanction reports is a really good idea. I'm going to look at that in more detail. And then the final thing I just say on that is, echoing what Niall has said, it's not just about having mechanisms which facilitate the child being heard. It's also about ensuring that the ultimate decision maker, i.e. the judges, know that they're obliged to listen to the voice of the child. And that's why what the report says, and it's in the summary you've got, on both training and sentencing guidelines is really important, because it's not just making sure the voice is there, you've got to make sure you've got ears willing to listen. So there's work to be done on that side too.
And I would say there's some
very good work done by Albert Sachs, who was the judge who gave the lead judgment in S&M in the South African Constitutional Court, where he talks he's a very good storyteller, incredibly powerfully kind of about his experience as a judge hearing this case and about what it meant to change his way of understanding about listening and understanding what a pre-sentence report did in the context of a sole carer. And again, if anyone's interested, I've got a recording of him telling that story, but he's also written it down. It's incredibly powerful.
Fiona, I think everyone in the room has been so profoundly affected by what Ryan said and by the audio. You know, and you think about if in judicial training you could have people hearing that, and you could have people hearing lived experience about what this does and what the impact is. And for women who've been affected by it, who've received potentially a short sentence, and it's been devastating to their family life and their relationship with their children. And that kind of thing is hugely profound. We've all been affected by it here. And it's the kind of thing which decision makers need to hear too.
Yeah, hi, Maria Joyce from the National Traveller Women's Forum, and I just want to, on that last point that was made, just commend Ryan in terms of his contribution and testimony. It was really powerful, and in terms of your experience as a child of a parent in prison. I wasn't here earlier for the testimonies, but I think you're very much right. It is those voices that need to be informing the decision making at policy level in the context of this. And I just want to make two kind of points, very quick points. The discussions and the points being made around data this morning are really important and relevant in this area. And I think the importance of data collected with an equality focus is equally important in the context of ethnic minorities. And I know that there is an ethnic minority introduced into the Irish prison service, but we're still not seeing the data being stipulated in the way that it needs to be, because it's not just about numbers. It is about, you know, what is the responses that needed, what are the issues, and how they can be monitored and resourced. So that kind of continued push for equality-focused data. And what that means then in terms of the services in providing training to ensure that the way it's asked, when it's asked, and the regularity of it being asked for people coming into prison, particularly when you're looking at the additional barriers that ethnic minorities have, and in particular Traveller and Roma, and the overrepresentation of travellers in the Irish prison system, and the stark overrepresentation of Traveller women in the Irish prison system is not happening by accident. And it's not because Travellers and Traveller women are more criminal than anyone else. International research shows right across the globe, ethnic minorities are overrepresented within all prison systems. So the state has to be doing something wrong in terms of how it's responding to that. And certainly from the work we're doing with Traveller women in the Docus Centre, we know that there are women in there who should not be in prison, full stop. And we have it in legislation that no one should be in prison for fines. There are still people in prison, and there are certainly Travellers and Traveller women in prison for fines and short sentencing and non-violent sentencing that it breaks up the entire home. And the final point I'll just make on this, the issue of racism in terms of how it penetrates into this system and right through the criminal justice system in relation to those over-representation. And when you put that then in parallel with the over-representation of Traveller children in care, and the difficulties that Traveller women in prison have spoken about in relation to trying to stay connected to their children, reconnect to their children when they come out, is hugely impacted on, and particularly by short sentencing or sentences for non-violent crimes. And those points and observations that were made around really looking at the situation of the family and the situation of the woman, particularly where she's the head of the family, and which data in this country shows that Traveller women are more, there's a higher proportion of Traveller women caregivers than there is even the majority population of women based on the 2016 census. So all of those layers have additional impacts for some groups of women, including Traveller women. So it's really important that the responses and priorities are incorporating particular groups of women like Traveller women and other ethnic minority women.
That's so so important. It really is, and it's something that is just not being dealt with, and has to be. And you know, whether it's through data, through I mean, I can't say anything more powerfully than you just have. But I think one thing that we haven't actually talked about today is children in the care system, and mothers losing that custody, and then the difficulties of maintaining those links, and actually even doing work to kind of explore that space is difficult. I've been trying to kind of do some work in that space, and it's very difficult to find the people to talk to and to kind of work through that space. So another a loss of data and or a lack of data, which is really part of our problem. Yeah.
I'll make a comment on that. If I had more time, I would have liked to talk more about travellers in the system. When my dad went to prison, it was the travellers in the community who became my friends. It was them who stood up for me, and I probably wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them. And I've seen them, some of them now are in prison, and I believe it affects them even more so than the general population. The stigma they face both in prison and just in the traveller community, the family structure is so important. Separating them from that, I don't know any other group of people who struggle so much inside the prison. So I do really feel that there should be more effort put into understanding that and helping that.
Thank you. And I think we'll leave it on that point. I'm going to hand over to Molly. And I'd like to thank you for the really interesting questions and really excellent responses.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. And I know we've gone very significantly over time, so I apologise for that. And I think it's actually a sign of how much there is to say about this topic and how underexplored it is. We could probably have a whole day conference, and maybe, no promises, but maybe in due course we will when we have Ashling in the role a little longer. So I just want to very quickly thank you all so much for attending this morning's event. And we have been really delighted to see the significant interest there is in this important topic. And what is clear from today's event is that there is a broad consensus across many of the stakeholders of the need for action in this area. That is really encouraging to IPRT as we start to really focus more in this area in our work. And as we have the renewed funding for Ashling's role to kind of give it that focus and allow us to all work more closely with all of you in this room, both to build our existing network for children and families, but also implement the recommendations in this report and indeed in some of the other reports we have been publishing over the years. Mention of funding leads me naturally to thank, first and foremost, our extremely generous funders, without whom this work would not have been possible. And that is Catherine Howard Foundation, St Stephen's Green Trust, Portugal and Community Foundation Ireland. And without their support, this report, this event, and indeed this entire project would not be possible. So thank you so much for seeing the value of it and for really kind of giving it that renewed focus to allow us to continue working in the area. I'd also like to thank our report authors, Vicki and Sharon, so much for the work they did over the last few months, and also for travelling today to share the findings and recommendations of the report with us. And this report is only a scoping study, that's why we've called it that. I think there's probably more research that can be done in this area, and indeed that's something we will again be looking at as we have now kind of the resources to actually focus in on it even more in the future. And this report gives us an excellent basis from which to do that. I'd also like to thank all of our speakers who made time from their very busy schedules to attend today's event and to share their expert insights with us. And again, I think it's been really interesting to hear all of the various different perspectives that have been offered today. And also, it's really heartening for IPRT to see how much interest and support there actually is across the stakeholders for the work we're doing here. And I want to say a very special thank you to Fiona Donson, Dr. Fiona Donson, for chairing today's event so expertly, and also for all of her work as co-chair of the Action for Children and Families Network and her support for IPRT over the past few years as we have done work in this area. I'd also like to officially thank, even though he is not here, the anonymous young person who shared his experience of parental imprisonment for the purposes of today's event. And I do think it's been said, but both his and Ryan, your contributions are really important in just reminding us of the actual impact this has on people's lives. And I totally agree with Keelan's point that if you could maybe get that before judges and people who are making decisions, it would actually go a long way in making some impact and getting this kind of on people's radar. Because I know from my own experience working in the legal system, sometimes it's just not something that is even considered, you know, the whole family and community around a person who actually ends up in the prison system. And I'd also like to really thank the IPRT staff and volunteers, Ashling, Michelle, Laura, Pamela and Paula, who have all worked extremely hard to pull together today's event. And I'd also like to thank Ashling in particular for all the work she has achieved so far in only 3 months since starting with IPRT. As is hopefully clear from this event, it is only today. Today is really only marking the start of our kind of increased focus in this area of children and families affected by imprisonment. And we're really looking forward to seeing you all and working with you all in the future on this topic. And with that in mind, I'd invite you all to try and catch me or Ashling or any of the IPRT staff now just to have a quick chat, or indeed to make contact over the coming weeks and months to see how we might work together better in this area. So thank you so much all for attending, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of the afternoon. And if you want to grab a pastry, I think there are lots left over, so please do, because we won't eat them all in the office. Thank you so much. Thank you.